Good evening and welcome back to the second class on the author of the letter to the Hebrews. Last time we talked about who could it possibly be? Is it Paul? Is it Apollos? Is it Silas? Luke? All of those wind up being insufficient. When we look at comparisons, at things we know about those other characters, and especially writing style, those characters have to be pretty much dismissed. When we come down to it, it looks like it must be a woman. We have a very good idea who that woman is, but there are certain things, like, for example, a certain elegance of style in writing. There is also you can tell that there's a feminine mind at work. And Pastor Elizabeth has actually recorded a reading of the epistle to the Hebrews. And so I would suggest that you give a listen to that, because it doesn't sound like like brotherly advice. It doesn't sound like fatherly admonitions. No, it sounds kind of like your mom. Um, well, one of the things that we want to ask as we're kind of building this psychological profile of the author of Hebrews, the second question we want to ask, the first question being, does the author have a feminine mind? The second question is, does the author identify with women? So we want to look at Hebrews and see if women of faith in religious history are acknowledged by the author, and are they by implication granted equality before God? As we're discussing the author's identification with women, we have to turn to one chapter in particular, the chapter 11 of Hebrews. That chapter is sometimes called the Heroes of Faith chapter, when in fact a better title would be Heroes and Heroines of Faith. A quick look at the 11th chapter shows two women, Sarah and Rahab, who are mentioned by name among the faithful. Then there's this curious reference to women who received their dead by resurrection. At the end of the chapter, the author states that despite the merit of all the faithful ones, their faith, along with ours, had not yet been perfected in Jesus. They were anticipating a completion of their faith, just like we had to. So the women who received their dead by resurrection were not women of the New Testament times because they had seen Jesus. Their faith had been perfected. Rather, these are women of faith who received their dead by resurrection in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Some cannot be mentioned by name because their names are never recorded in the scriptures, sadly. Nevertheless, there's two women who are specifically referenced. The widow of Zeraphath. Remember, her son was restored to life by Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 24. And then there was the Shunammite woman whose son was resurrected by Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4, 18 through 37. The author of Hebrews speaks of the faith of these two women. And we'll talk about Sarah and Rahab a little bit later, but these two women, the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman, the author of Hebrews speaks of these two women with a faith that is that enables miraculous events to take place. If a man were telling the story, it would be pretty much run of the mill to expect that the story would be told in a very different way, with Elijah and Elisha being the protagonist who did miraculous things by their faith. Rather, in Hebrews' reading of it, or in the reading in Hebrews of the story, in the author's writing, it's the faith of these women who allowed their sons to be resurrected and who received the resurrection of the dead because of their faith. Well, as a matter of fact, a man did tell the story, not in Hebrews, but there was a man named Sirach, and his story is found in the apocryphal book named Sirach, or sometimes we'll see it called Ecclesiasticus. In Sirach chapter 48, verses 4 and 5, we read how glorious you were, Elijah. This is a quote from Sirach 48. How glorious you were, Elijah, in your wondrous deeds. You raised a corpse from death and from Hades by the word of the Most High. Well, as for Elisha, then, we're told by Sirach that Elisha performed miracles with every utterance of his mouth. Nothing was too hard for him, and when he was dead, his body prophesied. Remember the story that when Elisha had died, that they had buried him, and later on, a guy was thrown into the grave with the bones of Elisha, and the guy came back to life, that even the bones of Elisha had some kind of resurrecting power. Now, the author of Hebrews was familiar with this roll call of faith, especially in Ecclesiasticus, because Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach, was a part of the Greek Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, Hebrews follows right along with Ecclesiasticus in mentioning Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Moses. But while Sirach mentions Abraham, he does not mention Sarah. And while he praises Joshua, he does not name Rahab. By contrast, the author of Hebrews only alludes to Joshua, but doesn't name him, naming Rahab instead for her role in helping Joshua's spies. There is a reference to Rahab in James 2:25, in which Rahab is described as justified by works in saving the spies. But in Hebrews, there's a little bit of a different story. Hebrews reads, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had received the spies in peace. Clement of Rome, writing about the year 96, twice stated in his epistle to the Corinthians that Rahab acted through faith. That was in 1 Clement chapter 12. He adds a new element to Rahab, saying that she had this spiritual discernment by saying not only faith, but prophecy was to be found in the woman. And it can be argued that, and it has been argued, that the inclusion of Rahab, a harlot, as a hero of faith was maybe a bit far-fetched. But there she is in Hebrews chapter 11, and the author of Hebrews placed her there. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, and other rabbinic writers didn't regard Rahab as a prostitute at all. In fact, they said she was an innkeeper. In fact, there are several manuscripts that have mentioned Rahab, the so-called prostitute. It seems that happens a lot, that women of great importance somehow get that tag put on them. We can think of Mary Magdalene, for example. Now, the truth of the matter is that Rahab was probably a very respectable innkeeper, because the Hebrew word zonah can also be translated as an innkeeper. And we favor that translation because of Rahab's personal qualities. We are told certain things about him. So we believe that Rahab managed an inn and was welcoming to travelers, and this should carry no more stigma than any other hostess would carry. As for Rahab's personal qualities, she not only believed in God, but she had a spiritual discernment to recognize the divine leading of the Israelite mission. Matthew also names Rahab as the wife of a leading member of the community. All of this is pretty inconsistent with the tradition that Rahab was a harlot. In any event, through faith and repentance, her life was touched and changed by the divine drama in which she played so prominent a role. Then there's Sarah, the widow of Zeraphath, the Shunammite woman, and Rahab. All four of them are not the only women mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. There are others, although their presence isn't immediately obvious. This is why the author of Hebrews, finding the author is like a great detective story. One woman referenced in chapter 11 was Judith, who is also found in the Apocrypha, who is called a person who won strength, W-O-N, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign enemies to flight. That's in Hebrews 11:34. Judith, who is a devout woman, begged God in prayer for strength to defeat the Assyrians. She prayed, "Give to me, a widow, the strong hand to do what I plan to do," in Judith chapter 9, verse 9. Her valiant deed was in killing the Assyrian general named Holofernes. She killed him with a sword. So in one place in Judith, it talks about her doing manly deeds. Well, that's language you would expect from that time. But in fact, we find out that she can do anything any of the guys can do. It need not be referred to as simply a manly deed. Another woman who's referenced, but is not really called by name, is Esther, following Judith, with such terminology as perfection in faith. And this is reminiscent of the writings, again, in Hebrews. Hebrews 11:34, it talks about one who escaped the edge of the sword. When we read in Esther chapter 4, verse 11, we're told that there was no escape for anyone who approached the king unbidden. And yet, that's exactly what Esther did. She walked into the presence of the king without being called for, and she did, in fact, escape the sword. We can also find in Hebrews a certain imitative language from the apocryphal book called 4th Maccabees. 4th Maccabees, in all likelihood, was the last book in Priscilla's Bible, her Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it says that there was certain language that talks about they went about in skins of sheep and goats. They wandered in dense mountains and in caves. All of that is an echo from even 2nd Maccabees, chapter 10, verse 6, which reads that they had been, these women had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. All right, so what does all this have to do with female heroes of the faith? The book of the Maccabees is concerned with praise for a certain mother and her 7 sons. These 7 sons were encouraged by their mother. She's not named, but they're encouraged by her to stand strong in their faith, to not renounce the faith, even though the monstrous tortures of the great king was nightmarish. Well, the 7 sons did not give up. They did not renounce their faith, and they were tortured and, of course, killed. The author of Maccabees wrote that they vindicated their nation, looking to God and enduring torture, even to death. It's in 4th Maccabees 16:10. Sound familiar? Well, just as these witnesses persevered in their faith, looking to God and resisting to the point of shedding their blood, we're also, Hebrews says, to run with perseverance that which is set before us, looking to Jesus. Remember how the author writes, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who endured the cross. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4 says. So we can identify these following women in Hebrews chapter 11. There was Sarah, there was Rahab, there was the widow of Zeraphath, there was the Shunammite woman, there was Judith, there was Esther, and then there was the mother of those 7 sons. And remember, when the author of Hebrews is writing about women like Judith and the mother of the 7 sons, which comes from books that are not included in our canonized Old Testament, it was in the author's Old Testament or Bible. They didn't have a New Testament at that point. In fact, the author of Hebrews probably had no idea that she would be contributing to a New Testament. Okay, before we finish up on these characters, we need to pause and consider Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the first woman named as a hero of faith. Now, a controversy has kind of stewed around the place of Sarah in that roll call, and there are certain issues that need to be resolved. Now, when we think of Sarah, we usually think of one thing, and that is that she laughed when the messengers were telling Abraham that she was going to bear a child. We need to clear that up, I think. The verse in question is Hebrews 11:11. It reads, "By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had made the promise." This verse follows three sentences in which Abraham's faith is described like this. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place. Remember when he was told to leave Ur of the Chaldees and to go off into a land that he would be shown. By faith, he obeyed. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise as in a foreign land, for he looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Nice. Immediately following that verse is, by faith, Sarah herself is the opening. By faith, Sarah herself. That feminine pronoun herself is intensive. What I mean is the pronoun herself is really unnecessary, but it's used for emphasis. In the most straightforward view of this sentence, Sarah, in the nominative case, makes her the subject of the sentence. Some commentators want to claim that Abraham is the subject and not Sarah, making Abraham alone the exemplar of faith in this series of sentences. In some translations, Abraham has actually supplanted Sarah as the model of faith in the text, and Sarah, as a model of faith, has been demoted to just a footnote. Some people object to the whole idea of having Sarah as a model of faith, thinking that she's not worthy or she's not a logical example. But remember, we're reconstructing the psychological profile of the author of Hebrews. So if Sarah is in fact a dubious example, we have to say that either one, the author is willing to overlook Sarah's failures and to see her in a favorable light, and that's probably a woman and not a man who would in fact overlook Sarah's initial skepticism. Or maybe the author took a second look at Sarah's skepticism, looked at it from a different perspective. The time has come for us to do the same thing. The incident we're talking about is found in Genesis chapter 18. These three supernatural messengers, call them angels, tell Abraham that Sarah will conceive and bear a son. Now, it tells us that Sarah overhears their conversation, and since she is way past the age for childbearing, she laughed to herself. But consider this, no one has said anything directly to Sarah yet. Unlike Abraham, Sarah hasn't had the opportunity to evaluate the authority of these messengers and their message. She hasn't been able to experience the supernatural charisma of these messengers. In fact, Sarah wasn't even asked why she laughed, but the question was put to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh? Apparently, Sarah was finally able to evaluate the messengers, and she found herself in awe of them. It was out of her fear that she denied laughing. She was nervous. These guys asked her, "Oh, how come you're laughing?" I didn't laugh. No, sir. Wouldn't be laughing at angels. Not at all. No, sir, you betcha. So then are we just supposed to dismiss Sarah as some kind of a bemused skeptic? No. But look at chapter 17 of Genesis, verses 15 through 17, which reads, God said to Abraham. Now, this was a direct message from a trio of visitors. This is not a direct message from a trio of visitors. Rather, it says, God said to Abraham, this is revelation from heaven. God said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, pay attention. As for Sarah, your wife, I will bless her. And moreover, I will give you a son by her. Full stop. Then the second sentence, I will bless her, and she shall give rise to nations, and kings of people shall come from her. Wowee. Twice she's blessed. So before we want to dismiss Sarah as being a skeptic or being unfaithful, twice God calls her blessed. Look how Abraham responded to the promise from God. We're all so critical of Sarah laughing about these messengers, but now God has said to Abraham, this is going to happen. But Genesis 17:17 says that then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. We need to visualize this. Okay, first off, you have three guys. Okay, these three messengers come and they tell Abraham, and what's his response there? Well, we're really not quite sure, but we know that Sarah laughs about that. She's laughing about these three guys who were given a message. God himself, according to the text, says that that God spoke to Abraham, and we want to have the image that he bowed low. We have the impression that Abraham was bowing in submission, humbling himself. That's not the case. When we look at this more clearly, what we have happening here from a better translation of the Hebrew, it reads, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Abraham was bent over double, not because he's bowing in obedience or bowing in submission. He was convulsed with laughter. That's the way the Hebrew should read. I should say that's the way the Hebrew reads, and that's the way it should be translated for us. Even worse, some say that Abraham was putting on a show by bowing in front of God, but laughing in his heart at the divine revelation. In either case, we should ask ourselves, why does the world remember Sarah's subdued laughter, of which she soon repented, fearful because she did in fact believe? And why do we hold her culpable for it, while at the same time we forget that Abraham literally, and I mean literally, fell on his face, overcome with what can only be called derisive laughter? One commentator says, it is a generous interpretation of the text to assume Sarah acted by faith. A generous interpretation. Okay, well, maybe that's exactly what we should be adding to the author's psychological profile then. She has a generosity in evaluating the spiritual role of Sarah in her nation's history. She sees Sarah's intrinsic faithfulness instead of her momentary confusion and disbelief. In this case, the author of Hebrews is truly a feminist. Abraham is said to have looked forward to a city whose foundations, whose architect and builder is God. But in the next sentence, it says Sarah was enabled to found a posterity and a fulfillment of God's promise. Apparently, the author of Hebrews is intentionally comparing the two. On the one hand, there was this city who had the foundations, which was the capital of the nation. And on the other hand, there's Isaac, the son of Sarah, who was the foundation of the chosen people, the seed of Abraham, destined to be the heir of promise, to be the heir of the land of promise, and to be the heir of that city which had the foundations. So once again, and sadly, there are those translators and commentators who want to make Abraham alone as the model of faith, who want to make Abraham the focus of the story, even going so far as to say that the promise for procreation was to Abraham and not to Sarah. Some want to say that Abraham was the one who is past childbearing years, but that's just bad grammar, and it shows a shocking ignorance of human biology and physiology. Exactly when would a man be past childbearing years? I don't know, from birth, maybe? Some want to read that Abraham became the father of Isaac, even though Sarah was barren, as it said. And all of this forms the very basest form of prejudice and chauvinism. There are several things in the language and in the style in trying to that create problems when you're trying to make Abraham the subject. While we know that the word order is flexible in Greek, there's certainly some logical limits to it. So which sentence sounds smoother and more elegant? Is it, by faith, he received power for procreation, even though he was past the right age and Sarah herself was barren? As compared to, by faith, Sarah herself, though barren, was enabled to found a posterity. Which one's awkward? Which one's the more elegant? Well, it's the second one, isn't it? It is the more elegant construct that is really in conformity with the rest of the letter to the Hebrews. To read it in the first way as Abraham being the subject of he was past childbearing years. He was the one who had been given the power of procreation. All of that winds up being really clunky Greek, and the rest of Hebrews does not read that way. No, it has to be read that Sarah is the object there, who was given this power by faith, who was given this power to become the founder of a nation through her. Evidence for the reference to childbearing past normal age and stylistic considerations secured the place of Sarah as the subject of the Hebrews.
Travis, I'm popping on just briefly because I love all this. And while you were talking, I looked up a couple translations that do say that. So for those of us who might want to go read it, what you're talking about, both the Message and the Amplified Bible, those are two that I go to help get some more context, or they expand the Greek and the Hebrew. So if you're not familiar with those like the Amplified Bible especially. So the Message is the one that paraphrases things, but both of them are spot on with this translation. Because the NRSV is not, which is my default. And I know
is not, and mine too.
Yep.
And in fact, in the New Revised Standard Version, that was one of the things that Walter Harrelson, who was the chairman of the Old Testament Committee, and I was fortunate enough to be his student while they were doing the translation of the NRSV. He was the one who said, "Look, we did the committee in a democratic way, and we voted on the translations, but they got this one wrong." So he himself had said, this is a bad rendering of it. The focus has to be on Sarah. So kind of cool. So we were, where were we? Oh, about, so we were talking about the evidence of the past the childbearing age and all that. So Sarah is the one who should be read as a model of faith in the Hebrews reading. So we need to think, how does the author think about Sarah and go beyond the conventional view that Sarah fell from grace by laughing at the revelation of God? The author of Hebrews knows, as all believers must know, that temporary doubt and fear and denial can be transmuted into steadfast faith. If that weren't true, what hope would any of us have on our spiritual journey? There's another woman who's mentioned, though not by name, in Hebrews chapter 11. In verse 23, we read, "By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child, his parents, saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." That story is originally told in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. In Exodus, the mother is, she acts alone in making the decision, preparing the papyrus basket, placing the basket on the riverbank, while the sister of the baby, Moses, stood watch. In the Septuagint, the Greek Hebrew Bible, again, which was the Bible of the author of Hebrews, both parents are credited with hiding the baby for 3 months. Exodus 2, verse 3 says that when they could no longer hide him, his mother took for him an ark and besmeared it with bitumen and cast the child into it and put it in the ooze by the river. That's a nasty image. The ooze. So what we have is not the image that so many times in dramas that we see, that baby Moses is put into this little papyrus ark and sent sailing down the aisle. No, actually kind of put there, left there, where the ooze and the reeds and all that stuff would keep it from floating away. So that's how the sister is able to keep watch over that basket. This is the chapter we talked about last week, or the episode, when we find a rather sympathetic reference to Pharaoh's daughter. How Pharaoh's daughter becomes the foster mother of Moses. And when Moses makes his proclamation and makes his decision, then he has to leave Pharaoh's daughter. And it's a little bit of a heartbreaking scene for Pharaoh's daughter. Again, would a man write an episode that was sympathetic to the enemy's princess? Probably not. Why are there so many women in the 11th chapter, or the Heroes of Faith chapter, in the Epistle to the Hebrews? The obvious answer is because a woman wrote it. So before we leave chapter 11, we can also look, we can, what do I want to say, discern a reference to the ministry of 3 additional women in that chapter. Although the women themselves aren't listed in the catalog of heroes, their contribution to religious history is included in the story. In verse 32, there are 3 pairs of names of these great heroes of faith. There's Barak and Gideon, there's Jephthah and Samson, and there's Samuel and David. Chronologically, that's how they should appear. But the author of Hebrews does a bit of chronological inverting and actually calls the more important person first. So the way Hebrews names it is Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, and David and Samuel. Each of the lesser individuals, those who were named second, were all indebted to a woman for their place in history. In Judges chapter 5, in fact, verses 4 and 5, Barak, this is one of the great stories of the Old Testament. Barak, the people of Israel are, well, actually, they were still a confederation at that time. There wasn't a kingdom of Israel, but they were going to be attacked from the north by Sisera. And so Barak is trying to mobilize the tribes to defend Israel against Sisera's attack. And so Barak goes to Deborah, and he goes, I need your help. And she goes, you can do this. You go out and do it. He goes, I need you. And she goes, okay, we'll do it, but you're going to lose your glory to a woman. Funny thing is, she didn't mean herself. What happens in the story, and really read this story, it's a good one, is that here we go. Let's have a little fun. I'm going to read it for you. In Judges, chapters 4 and 5. Okay, going to take it from the top. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. After Ehud died, the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron. Sisera did, not the Lord, and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali, and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army. I will meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Then she said, I surely will go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. She's not talking about herself. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had encamped as far away as Elon Bezananim, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, was gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Wadi Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes to ask you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the tent peg into his temple until it went down to the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then, as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead, with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. Now, what follows next is called chapter 5 is called the Song of Deborah. And it goes on with this long description of it. But the very last couple of stanzas of it in this song that was chanted, it said, "Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell, dead." Wow. First off, that's just some beautiful imagery. I mean, okay, sure, blood and hammers and tent pegs in the temple and all that stuff. But beside all that, the image of the way that it's written there, it's almost like this slowly spinning down. Now, in chapter 4, it says that he was laying on the ground and she went up and popped it into his head while he was laying there. In this story, he's like, you can almost imagine him holding up a bowl to drink, and she slips up and puts the tent peg by his head while he's standing there drinking, and then she drives it in with the mallet. And it's this slow, almost like this slow spinning down of where he stood, there he fell, there he sank to the ground, and there he fell dead. There where he sank, he fell, once again dead. So it's this double rendering of how this woman, was she acting like a man? No, she was acting like somebody who was faithful and empowered and had the vision of what was necessary to save the people. A hero of faith? Yeah, you betcha. So Barak, as we read, owes his victory to Deborah, and indirectly also, or maybe not so indirectly, owes his victory to Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. We know that Jephthah, moving on, owed his victory to his daughter's sacrifice in Judges chapter 11. And Samuel owed his ministry to the dedication of his mother, Hannah, in First Samuel chapter. Well, there we go. It just went away from me. Anyway, so chapter 1, of course. So by resulting to this subtle linguistic device of name inversions, the author of Hebrews is conveying a message that God used the discrete ministries of women, singularly chosen by God, to bring about history shaping deliverance by the hand of Gideon and Samson and David. The references to women in the 11th chapter really do illustrate the casualties of biblical history. Sarah originated the people of God. Rahab facilitated their entry into the promised land, and Hannah, through Samuel, was the contributor to the rise of the great King David. In addition to all of that, the very subtlety with which that theme is developed in the letter to the Hebrews suggests a restrained hand. Again, not the hand of Paul, who was never restrained, not the hand of Luke, not Silas, not Barnabas, not any of the rest of them. This is the hand of a woman who is writing this story. But one more thing. Think about the naming of Jephthah as a hero of faith. Some people believe, or in case you don't remember the story of Jephthah, remember he had basically offered to sacrifice his daughter for the victory that Israel enjoyed. Some people think that his sacrifice of his daughter could not possibly include him in the roll call of the heroes of faith. Pardon me. Certainly, a female author of Hebrews would not have included him because of the sacrifice of his daughter, right? Well, there's a couple of possible replies to that objection. First, the author may simply not have thought of the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter in the same context that we do. Maybe the author regarded it as the sacrifice that secured Jephthah's victory. I don't quite buy that one. The other suggestion, and that obviously I do buy, is that Jephthah did not, in fact, kill his daughter, but he sacrificed her in a sense of dedicating her to the temple. More likely that Jephthah's vow was kind of modified, and his daughter was not, in fact, killed. In fact, the sacrifice of sons and daughters was explicitly forbidden in Israelite law. It was considered an abomination. Remember, they were in one place. It had talked about the abomination of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and other Canaanites who would sacrifice their children. They called it an abomination. So, yeah, Jephthah's vow would have been declared illegal. And it could have been annulled by simply the payment of a fine, not necessarily money. Now, since the daughter, as a human and a female, was not acceptable as a burnt offering, she could have been otherwise dedicated. Many scholars, and I'm one of them, believe that Jephthah's daughter was sacrificed in the sense of being taken away from the family, dedicated to the temple as a caretaker to live out her life in celibacy and maybe even in some confinement. There's certain rabbinical writings that talk about 4 times a year that the women of Israel would be able to go and see her and go to her for prayer and advice and guidance. So the author of Hebrews actually has a rather superb judgment of Jephthah, as does the author of 1 Samuel, which indicates to us that both of them must agree that Jephthah's daughter was not killed, but she was consigned to an isolated life serving the temple. Now, a lot of people would consider that, horrible enough, but not so in that time. I mean, for one thing, it's going to be a comfortable life. She's not going to have to work like the other Israelite women had to. Yes, she would be denied a family and denied being able to go out into the community, but she was sacrificed for service to the temple. So when we look at Hebrews chapter 11, to summarize that, the presence of women is so pervasive in Hebrews chapter 11. Their influences are, in all cases, so noble, so unheralded, so sometimes sadly forgotten. But always their deeds are essential in God's providential activity. And their faith becomes the touchstone of faith for all of us. There is no other chapter in the whole New Testament, indeed the whole Bible, that so points to the equality of women of faith, to their importance, and basically saying that you think that we wouldn't have our history if it weren't for the guys. Well, we wouldn't have our history if it weren't for the women also. It is a remarkable letter, and definitely, or a chapter in the letter, and definitely one that makes us realize that, yeah, this is a woman who wrote this. So here's where we can call it quits for the week. But if you have any questions, fire away.